The scripture reading for this morning is Psalms chapter 79, verses 1 through 7. O God, the nations have invaded your inheritance. They have defiled your holy temple. They have laid Jerusalem in ruins. They have given the dead bodies of your servants for food to the birds of the heavens, and the flesh of your godly ones to the beasts of the earth. They have poured out their blood like water round about Jerusalem, and there was no one to bury them. We have become a reproach to our neighbors, a scoffing, a derision to those around us. How long, O Lord, will you be angry forever? Will your jealousy burn like fire? Pour out your wrath upon the nations which do not know you, and upon the kingdom which do not call upon your name. For they have devoured Jacob and laid waste in his habitation.
Good morning. If you haven't, I'm going to switch it up today. I know normally when I do the scripture reading, that's where we're going to be at, but I snuck this by you. We're actually going to be in Genesis chapter 18 for the majority of the lesson today. But, you know, I had some of the guys that preach at Brownsburg were talking about how they use adjacent passages to, like, inform the lesson without making it the foundational verse. So I was like, you know what, I'm going to try that. I don't know if I like it that much, but we'll try it, you know. But I do like Psalm 79. I guess you guys recently went through it, though based on Jim's lack of knowing where you guys are at, I don't know how well you went through it. But Psalm 79 is kind of an interesting psalm where you get these people that are crying out to their God, asking, you know, how long do we have to wait for this judgment to be passed? For those that, you know, scoff at you, God, those that call out your name mockingly, how long will you wait to, you know, respond to them? How long will we have to wait for you to, you know, basically justify us in our stance of supporting you, as well as you standing up for yourself and revealing yourself to them? And so I thought about how very similar that is to our line of thinking at times, where we see injustices, we see difficulties in the world, we see things going opposite of the way that God has intended them to, because people are living godless lives, right? You know, and that's really at the core of why there are problems in the world, is because there is a separation between God's intended path for man and the path that man wants to tread alone, right? That's where things have always gone off the rails. And that's really, when you go back to the story in Genesis with Adam and Eve, they broke off from which path that God wanted them to. You know, they started to think that God was holding back from them, and they needed to break off and find this new revealing knowledge that was going to change everything for them. And the funny thing is, they got what they wanted. It just wasn't what they wanted at the same time, right? It's like that story's fascinating because Satan lies to them and kind of misleads them, but he also, in a lot of ways, tells them exactly what's going to happen. And everything kind of falls into place from there. But that has been the problem with humanity since Adam and Eve sinned in the garden. We have wanted to go our own way. And now we have, as people of God, when we are trying to do the right things, there are moments where we're just asking God to, you know, can you just bring some judgment? Can you make things right? You know, can you stand up and reveal yourself? Because we live in a mocking generation where people are looking for signs. They want you to prove yourself. They want you to show yourself. And it's very easy to be kind of jaded and become coarse because of the way that the world acts, for us to become a people where it's like, I'm ready to deal out death and judgment, right? And it's easy for us to think like, you know, I just want to get up on Sunday morning and talk about how God's bringing the judgment. Judgment is coming. And I get that. And it is. That is the truth. It is coming. God is going to bring the judgment. But the reason I wanted to talk about the mercy of the Lord is because even in dark days, in difficult situations where we're struggling, we need to remember that God is a God of mercy. And the reason I brought up Psalm 79 is because I always imagine those passages, that was bad. I've gotten really bad as a teacher where I just start not knowing how to speak. I speak so much during the day as a teacher. Like, I do that at least 10 times a day now, I feel like. So I apologize if you get 3 or 4 of those today. But I think of Psalm 79 as like, I'm feeling good. I'm in a good place spiritually, and I see the wickedness of man, and I'm just like, God, can you stand up and reveal yourself and show yourself to these people and reveal how great you are and your place as the judge. That's how I feel in the good days. But then if you jump back just a page to Psalm 78, and I know, I had you guys turn to Genesis 18, so it's fine. We're not going to read through Psalm 78, but it kind of goes in a different direction that we're going to touch on a little bit later, which is why I kind of want to focus on the mercy of the Lord today, is because so often when we're feeling good, we think about Psalm 79 and like, God, come and bring judgment. But then we're also in those days where we're struggling. We've done wrong. We know we're in the wrong on things. We know we've made mistakes. We don't feel adequate. We don't feel like we're worth it to God. And those are the days where maybe we're not reading Psalm 79 as boldly and proclaiming it as loudly as we might do on other days. And so we're going to kind of jump into Psalm 78 a little bit as well this morning. But there's going to be some common themes that go back and forth between Psalm 78 and 79 that really tie into Genesis chapter 18, I believe. And so I'll be jumping back there a little bit, but just kind of get your minds thinking about, that Psalm 79 passage, where we might be mentally in that, and then how we can be on the opposite end of that spectrum at times. So in Genesis chapter 18, though, getting to our main foundational verses in Genesis 18. In Genesis 18, we have the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. We have the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and I think that a lot of times we use the combination of, that Psalm 79 focus, the judgment that God is going to bring. And that's how we connect it to this great story of absolute evil and people that are beyond saving, people that are beyond any sort of help, and God bringing down the judgment on these people. And while I do think there are important connections with that, I do want us to get a different focus and focus on how does the mercy of God shine through this passage, this story here in Genesis 18. Now, before we even get to, any of the smaller details of the story, it's important to know in Genesis 18, if you look in verse 20 and verse 21, why has the Lord come to Abraham and met him while he's, encamped there in the land? And he says basically, why am I here? Why are these visitors here that Abraham welcomes in? He shows this great hospitality to. In verse 20, it says, the Lord said, because the outcry is great against Sodom and Gomorrah, and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me, and if not, I will know. So the first thing I think this sets the stage for, that I think actually is at the very baseline of questions that people have about God, and whether in good times or in bad. The first question everybody has, does God know? Does God care? Right? Is God listening? Is God paying attention to my struggles? Is God paying attention to the evil? Is God paying attention to what is happening on the earth? And here in Genesis 18, God starts off this stream of communication between him and Abraham, and he says, I hear it. I hear it. You didn't have to call and tell me. I've heard it. I've heard the outcry. I've heard the crying out from the evil that is being done in this city. And I've come to see if things are as they appear to be. I've come to see it for myself. Now, God obviously doesn't have to, right? He knows from a distance. He doesn't have to actually send these servants of God to actually go view it and be like, hey, God, yeah, it's right. You heard right. But, he's going to see firsthand what this is about. And so that's what's brought God to this situation. And now we have this interaction with Abraham. Okay? And before we get into the interaction back and forth with God and Abraham, the truth is that a huge theme of Genesis is the closeness of God and Abraham. the absolute tight-knit relationship that these two have, that God and Abraham have. That we talk so much about the promises made to Abraham. Why do we think he made the promises to Abraham? A large portion of it is because of who Abraham was, the kind of man he was, and he proves it over the story of his life that we have played out for us in the book of Genesis. So before even you get into this story of God and Abraham going back and forth in this bargaining that they have, the truth is that this is all founded based on this tight-knit relationship that these two have. That Abraham, who is going to devote his life and the leading of his family and future generations into following after God, to being a righteous group of people built on righteousness and mercy and these kinds of things, and how that goes in line with what God wants for his people. That's what's important throughout this entire thread of the story, is understanding like this is a common theme throughout the book of Genesis, is God's close relationship with this family, and here in particular with the father of this family, the patriarch Abraham. And so when you get into verse 22 and following through the remainder of chapter 18, and we have this back and forth here, it's important to note the closeness of that relationship. And so you've probably heard it before in a Bible class or in a lesson, but Abraham and God go back and forth as he's talking here with the servants of the Lord that have come. And the Lord eventually says to Abraham, if I find at Sodom 50 righteous people in the city, I will spare the whole place. Abraham goes back. Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. Suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for a lack of 5? And he said, I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. And again he said to him, suppose 40 found there. He answered, for the sake of 40, I will not do it. Then he said, oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 are found there. He answered, I will not do it if I find 30 there. He said, behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are found there. He answered, for the sake of 20, I will not destroy it. Then he said, oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak again, but this once. Suppose 10 are found there. He answered, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. And the Lord went his way when he had finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. Okay, so a very famous interaction between God and man, and this interaction between the Lord and Abraham. And I think it's just kind of a hilarious story to begin with. Like, have you ever met someone like really famous before? How many people would you say you've met someone like extremely famous? Anyone in here like you'd be like, and I know maybe somebody's thinking of a name and they're like, I'm actually the only one that knows that name, but I haven't really met anyone that famous. I've always had I've told plenty of people this, and if you have questions why, I can tell you why, but the only person I've been so sure I would be absolutely starstruck with would be Arnold Schwarzenegger, okay? It's just, that's my childhood there, all right? That was the guy who, if I could pick one person to save us from the alien invasion, outside of Jesus and, God, that's the guy I'm sending, That was my childhood. That was my childhood hero. And so I've always kind of, I can't imagine speaking in the same way, the way that Abraham speaks to God, where there's this back and forth communication like this. But I imagine imagine going up to your childhood hero, going up to this super famous person you've always wanted to meet, and then it's just hey, can I get an autograph? Hey, can I also get a picture? Okay, can you sign the picture? All right, can you come over to my house for dinner and sit down and have dinner with me and my family? It's kind of a crazy combination of just keep asking more and more and more, right? When, I think you kind of get this idea of when people interact with famous people, it's just all right, I want this to be cool. I want it to be memorable. I want them to somehow like me and eventually ask for my number, and we're going to be friends. And people, you kind of get that feeling. So it's I can't overextend myself. Can't become too crazy here. So it's just play it cool. But Abraham is just okay, but 25. 20. It's just kind of a crazy back and forth. And Abraham keeps responding the way that I feel I would in that situation where it's like, I'm nothing here, but like beg a bit of patience from you again, Lord. Like, can you take 10 off of that? Like, and in a lot of ways, it's just a crazy interaction to see, kind of a hilarious thing, but you go back and talk about that main theme I mentioned earlier, though. This relationship that God has with Abraham. The trust that, God puts in Abraham to carry these promises that he's going to carry. And Abraham's trusting God to be able to go to God on behalf of, these people in Sodom. And mainly, we know he knows that Lot is there and his family. And so he's pleading with God to, spare this people. And, one thing that truly denotes how great this relationship is one thing we don't talk about normally from Genesis chapter 12 when we read the promises. We talk about those 3 promises. God supports Abraham so much. He says in Genesis chapter 12, those who curse you, I will curse them. And maybe we don't often make this connection, but if you actually jump back a few pages to Genesis chapter 14, Abraham's actually had dealings with the people of Sodom before. He's gone and rescued their people when they were taken captive, and Lot and his family was taken captive, and the things that they owned. Like, people came in and stole everything that they had, and Abraham goes and delivers them. And then Abraham has this interaction with these kings afterwards, one of them being Melchizedek, which is I think one of the coolest characters in the Bible for being there in such a short time. But in Genesis chapter 14, we have this interaction between the king of Sodom and Abraham. And Abraham's done this great, unbelievable feat, and God has blessed him to be successful in taking back everything that was lost and stolen. And then the king of Sodom comes up to him in this very arrogant fashion, and he says, you can take all the goods, but I want all my people back. Give me back all my people. Like that he's in a position of demands. And so there's this, it's very short, but it's this quick interaction where the king comes back and demands Abraham, give me back my people. These are my people. You can have all the goods and treasures. I don't want that. I just want the people. I want the power. I want the control back. And Abraham basically says, I don't want any of your stuff. I don't want you for a second to think that I have been blessed or been given any of these riches by your hand. I will take none of your things. And so it's a very small interaction, but it's a very, strained one. Very quickly, you kind of get a feeling for the king of Sodom even before we get to this story of Sodom and Gomorrah. But a bad interaction there. And so I don't know if we're going to say the king of Sodom tried to curse Abraham or anything like that. But, I think it kind of is fitting in there that they weren't on good footing to begin with. There was no strong relationship there. In fact, it was a very negative one. And so God will show that those who oppose Abraham, those that try and go against his family, that try and curse him, God is not only going to bless Abraham, he's going to curse those that curse him. And so this tight-knit relationship extends even to this situation, perhaps, where Abraham and the king of Sodom had a very strained relationship in the short time that they interacted. But I mentioned this is the story of not just the judgment of God, like we often want to talk about because of how wicked the people of Sodom are, and we'll get to that in a moment. But here we have this first thread of why the story is, I believe, as much, if not more, about the mercy of God. Because I don't think this is God just, okay, 40, all right, 30. I don't look at it that way. I don't look at it the same way I don't look at Moses as totally convincing God not to kill everyone, right? I don't believe God was just on his last straw. I was like, I'm going to kill everyone, and then Moses saves the day, and God really wanted to give in and burn everything down and kill everything. I believe that was a situation for Moses to be the kind of man that God wanted him to be, and God, used that situation for him. In the same way here, I don't think Abraham was just like, God's going to kill everybody. I'm got to be the one to save them. I don't think that's it either. But I think this story shows who God is. All right? Because we get all the way down from starting up at 50 people down to 10. Over and over and over again. There's never a phrase of God's frustration, God's annoyance at Abraham's request, right? He continues to say, yes, for the sake of 45. Yes, for the sake of 30. Yes, for the sake of 20. Yes, for the sake of 10. I will spare the city, and I will not destroy it. Over and over again, God is showing how he's willing to be merciful for the sake of a smaller number of people. And I don't even know, and I haven't done much research on this, maybe somebody else can tell me after, how big the city actually was. You know, might be something I should look into, but I don't know how big the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah in that area actually was. But I know it's more than 50 people. I know it's more than 100. I know it's more than probably a few hundred, right? We're getting into lots of people probably that are going to be spared for the sake of a few. So I mentioned, Psalm 78. And I didn't really get into it yet because when we dive into this story with Abraham interceding for these people, and then we go directly to chapter 19, and we're like, okay, Abraham's like, maybe the people aren't that bad. Maybe they can be spared. Well, chapter 19 is basically like supposed to stand in this stark contrast to what just happened in chapter 18. Everything that Abraham is, these people are not. So let's read a few verses in chapter 19, and we'll compare that to Psalm 78. We'll read with Psalm 78 in just a moment. So in verse 19, let's just read the first few verses there and get a feel of what's going on in this city. It says, the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth and said, my lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way. They said, no, we will spend the night in the town square. But he pressed them strongly. So they turned aside to him and entered his house, and he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. When they called to Lot, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them. Lot went out to the men at the entrance, shut the door after him, and said, I beg you, brothers, do not act so wickedly. And there's a further back and forth here. But maybe for such a long time, we've just, known this story of Sodom and Gomorrah is so evil that those first few verses kind of wear a little bit thin, or they don't have the same meaning. Like, we all understand, though, this is about the worst possible group of people we can imagine, right? Notice what it says here again. Every man of Sodom, both young and old, all people to the last man. Every single person in this city came to Lot's house and requested him to give over these two men, these two angels. And they were going to rape them. And I've read some commentaries about how, back in older days, there were homosexuality was a thing that occurred, and it happened amongst people. But here, this is not the common practice or anything by any stretch of the imagination. This was, we are going to rape these men. This is how we are going to welcome them into this city. And it's everyone. It is a total saturation of evil in this located place. All right? Lot is surrounded by the most vile, horrible people. And you could see that even before we get to this revealing of the intentions of these people, you see the urgency in Lot going out to these men, seeing them from a ways off, and then going to them and being like, hey, here, let's go. I can help you stay at my house, and then you can be on your way as soon as possible. Right? He's trying to get them out. Whoa, knocked my notes off. He's trying to get them out of the city, right? He's trying to get them here, get them out, get on their way. Get where you need to go, because you definitely aren't wanting to come here. Right? This is how evil these people are. And so I feel like once we get to this point, it's like, I mean, if we were like on the fence, if we were waiting for like a jury, to come to a verdict, we're all like, oh yeah, we're killing all these people, right? Like we got to bring judgment. We got to punish them all. Like they're all, they're done. God's bringing the full judgment. And so, like, it starts off, and then you have to think back a few verses where Abraham's like begging God to spare on behalf of a few the entire city. Abraham's going to God, begging for God to spare this city on behalf of a few of these people. And yet God, reveals to us through his word here that there's not 10. They're all outside the door of Lot's house. They're all asking to engage in this evil sin. Right? They're all complicit in it. They're all together and united on this. So we get the information right away that there's not 10. There's not 10 available. And so this so-called treaty that between God and Abraham of spare on behalf of 10, it's off the board basically. Like we know that right from the get-go. And we're not going to spend a lot of time talking too much about the end of the story and how, Lot gets some of his family out of there. But we can even see within his own family, there's not full buy-in, right? There's not complete buy-in with all this. But I know I've been jumping around mentioning Psalm 78, but here's a few verses. I just want to read a couple sections. You don't need to turn back there. I'll just read a few and see if you kind of can make some connections here between the two. So this is kind of if you kind of remember like the story of Stephen when he's like recounting the whole history of the people of Israel, this passage in Psalm 78 in a lot of ways is very similar to that, going through the history of the people of Israel, talking about their exodus out of Egypt, talking about their dealings in the wilderness, all things like that. And so in verse 17, after it talks about what God has done for them, it says, "Yet they still sinned more against him, rebelling against the Most High in the desert. They tested God in their heart by demanding the food they craved. They spoke against God, saying, 'Can God spread a table in the wilderness?'" And then in verse 32, kind of jumping down, it kind of continues with this same description of the people's dealings. In spite of all this, and talking about a lot of the things that God did in those in-between passages between verse 19 and 32, it talks about some of the things that God did and the wonders he accomplished. In verse 32, in spite of all this, they still sinned. Despite his wonders, they did not believe. So he made their days vanish like a breath and their years in terror. When he killed them, they sought him. They repented and sought God earnestly. They remembered that God was their rock, the Most High God, their Redeemer. But they flattered him with their mouths. They lied to him with their tongues. Their heart was not steadfast toward him. They were not faithful to his covenant. Yet he, being compassionate, atoned for their iniquity and did not destroy them. He restrained his anger often and did not stir up all his wrath. He remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passes and comes not again. The reason I started with Psalm 79 and the reason I bring in Psalm 78 here and they kind of sandwich with the story of Genesis 18 and 19 with Sodom and Gomorrah is the fact there is no difference in the evil that is being done in Psalm 78 and here in chapter 19. I know we want to sit here and think so, but the truth is both are idolatry. Both are a group of people giving themselves over to a false god. Right? And God told his people many, many times, keep away from these people, don't mix with these other nations, don't buy into these false gods, and they did it anyway. Here, the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, it doesn't talk about one explicit god or anything, but they're worshiping themselves, right? They're giving over to this physical, lustful lifestyle in which they get to adhere to whatever sort of law and desires they want. The same thing with the people in the wilderness. When they would turn away from God, they were giving themselves over to some false idolatry. Some false god, whatever it was, slap a different name on it for a different day, but at the end of the day, it was all about themselves. And so we look at this story of Sodom and Gomorrah and we're like, man, God's just got to be like, I can't even imagine him ever caring about those kinds of people or anything like that. But then we read a whole book, all 66 books, going through God's character, God's nature, God's, plan and all these things. And he's saving a people like these people in Sodom and Gomorrah. A people that continue to lust after evil things, lust after their own desires. And I'm not here for you to say that, oh man, like things aren't terrible here in Sodom and Gomorrah, or they're really not that bad. I'm not saying that. The point is, though, we just want to build a hierarchy with things all the time. I get it. But the way God views sin is an adulterous relationship. However, whether it's with drugs, whether it's with sex, whether it's with money, whether it's with whatever, that's how God views it, is that he should be the relationship that you are seeking after and sticking to, and you've picked another one. So in a lot of ways, God's seeing these same situations. So when we read about in Psalm 78 how God is angry and frustrated, and he's seeing what these people are doing, and he's doing these miraculous, wondrous, glorious things, and they are still questioning, still doubting, still won't believe, saying one thing with their mouths, but with their tongues, they're really just lying. You can see how God, over the years, the frustration he has that builds with these people. And that's why when we get to a story like Sodom and Gomorrah, this wasn't the first day Sodom and Gomorrah had done this. The countless days beforehand, God was long-suffering, hoping that people would do the right thing. Right? God gets to these points where it's like, hey, judgment's going to be brought down. But the days beforehand, did God hate these people? Did God want to kill them? Did God want, whatever we think is like, we don't see those moments where God is laying witness to everything that goes on. Every single terrible thing that we've done, do you ever think about how God's seen every one of them? Not just the ones that you slipped up and you did something bad and you're like, I'm sorry. But the times when you did something wrong, you knew you did something wrong, you covered it up, you tried to hide it from other people, you've never really had to talk about it with anybody else. It's just kind of been between you and God, and you're kind of okay with that because as long as nobody else knows, it's like it kind of fades off into the distance, right? Like, think about all the terrible things God has seen, right? And so we want to make it this huge deal of like, this is about the judgment of God, and God hates these people, and he's going to get them, and this is awesome, this is what we want. But this is a sad day for God. The judgment he has to bring on these people, the wickedness that they have done. I know that I've talked about how this is the mercy of the Lord, and yet we haven't really gotten to, all right, where's the mercy, right? Well, the reason this story is about the mercy of God is because God goes further than Abraham even does. Because he is willing to save for the sake of one. He goes through all of this, and I know he goes to Lot, and he's going to deliver him out of this situation. But when you get to the end of the story, and we're not going to read this, but Lot gets out with his wife and his two daughters. His sons-in-law think he's joking when he tells them, hey, we got to get out, judgment's coming to the city. But, so they perish. His wife, as they're leaving, turns around, which she was commanded not to do. They were all commanded not to do. She perishes, turned into a pillar of salt. And then, do you guys know what happens to these daughters and Lot after they're delivered? Do you know what the daughters do? They're so terrified that they're going to grow old without any children. They get their father drunk, who it mentions is in old age. He's an older man. They get him drunk, they sleep with him so they can have their own kids, and it forms the Moabites and the Ammonites. So, a lot of wickedness takes place here, but we see that God's willing to go into this horrible, decrepit place that is full of such sin and wickedness for the sake of one. For the sake of one man. He was willing to go there and deliver that man. And I think that's a fascinating story. There's so much evil here, and yet the deliverance that God provides. In spite of all that, in spite of like the fact when people think of, Sodom and Gomorrah, we think of its destruction. We think of the evil and we think of the destruction. But as much tied to that is the fact that God is willing to go and deliver for the sake of one. And, just to kind of wrap up the lesson, and, I had a tough time figuring out, all right, all the ways in which mercy is displayed here is, pretty much in this deliverance of Lot. But then I thought of how God, from this story, is a long, drawn-out situation of him wading through sin and evil and man trying to disrupt his plans, and ultimately, though, is willing to send someone into the pit of the worst amount of sin, the worst amount of what the world had to offer, and deliver that group of people. And that's what the story of Jesus is about. Jesus coming and taking all of the sin that the world had to offer and putting it on his shoulders and nailing it to the cross. And the fascinating thing is, like I mentioned, these angels delivering Lot. Well, in Romans, it tells us when Christ died, when Christ came, there were no allies. Christ had no allies. Everyone, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Christ goes in, and obviously it's for the sake of all, but if they were waiting to find the one good person, the one sinless person, they weren't going to find any. The world was completely covered in sin. The world was completely filled with evil. Everyone had given over to it. And Jesus is sent to that. That's what Jesus is sent into and is called to deliver. And he delivers us out of it. So I think in a large way, the world is a greater, Sodom and Gomorrah, in which it didn't have to stay that way, though, because Christ had the ability to change it, to transform it. And you guys talked a lot about, the law and what Jesus came and brought something new, right? Well, what did Christ do? He brought something new in that he could make us something new, right? That's the biggest joy and wonder of the gospel. And the good news is that, hey, Christ has come, Christ has died, and because of that, you aren't going to be the same. You don't have to be the same. We don't have to be the same. We can be changed. We can be something different. We can be something better. We can put to death that old self and be born again to something new, something that's devoted to God. And so I just think that's a really cool illustration with it. I'm sure you'll find a better preacher to give a story on Sodom and Gomorrah, and they'll be like, this is all about the judgment of God, and you'll be like, I knew Caleb was wrong. But I just thought it was something fascinating, and I've really been struggling with the idea of judgment, how that works, how God works in judgment, and how does he say, when's enough? And really thinking, when's he, I'm glad he's never said enough's enough with me. You know what I mean? And I don't know if that just, varies from day to day whether I'm on a Psalm 78 mindset or I'm on a Psalm 79 mindset of, hey, I'm feeling like God come judge, or it's like, God, give me a few more days. Give me a few more days to get things right. But, it's amazing to look at God and to imagine that he's seen everything, and yet he still is like, you know what, I want Caleb. You know what I mean? I think it's special what kind of God we serve. And I saw this dumb video podcast or whatever, and these guys were talking about how, these examples of God and these stories in Genesis are really, mirror older stories that people said in the Middle East and all this stuff. And I was just like, that's nonsense. There's never been another example like Christ. There's never been another example like the God we serve, who has given so much for the sake of our salvation. No other example like that. Every other man-conceived God and idolatrous, following was always so different, so contrary to what we serve, who we serve, the God we serve, the sacrificial God, the God who's given everything, the God who has brought love and shown us the example of love. There is no other example like that. Any example you find is a knockoff of the God that we serve, and the knockoff is never as good as the original. And so we should be grateful that we serve this God, that we serve the Lord Jesus Christ, who has delivered us and who has made us something new. So if you have any needs that you have at this time, any prayers, if you need to be baptized, anything that you need, now is the great time to do it. Christ's invitation is here for all of you as we stand and sing this song.